From time to time, one comes across really exceptional stories, things that are quite unusual but which have an interesting message attached to them. Let's look at one of these cases in the United Kingdom, in fact in southern England, that I think will surprise you if you are not already familiar with it. Now, one of the hypotheses here is that one of the worst risks of disaster in Europe consists of Richard Montgomery. Well, who is Richard Montgomery? Well, I can tell you who he was. He was a general in the United States Army who in 1775 was killed in war and remains one of the iconic figures in the USA. But I'm not talking about him, I'm talking about the vessel, the Richard Montgomery, which was one of 2,761 so-called Liberty ships, which were constructed to move goods and munitions during the Second World War. And they were effectively constructed to the lowest possible standards. They were considered expendable ships and constructed as fast as possible. And a yard in Jacksonville, Florida, constructed the Richard Montgomery in 1943, and it was promptly used to move munitions across the Atlantic. And of course, they were well aware that many of the Liberty ships wouldn't make it across the Atlantic because the convoys were being torpedoed at regular intervals. So the Richard Montgomery was a standard sort of cargo ship of the kind that you would find in the 1940s, except built to a rather lower standard. In fact, many Liberty ships ended up sinking as a result of poor quality design and workmanship, but really they were not intended to last beyond the war particularly. It had a crew of 81, which essentially was divided between soldiers and sailors. And it was a cargo ship. And in 1944, on the 20th of August, with a convoy, the Richard Montgomery sailed into the Thames estuary, and it arrived in the Medway estuary off the Thames with a cargo of 6,127 tons of munitions of assorted kinds. And so it dropped anchor in the Medway estuary under the orders of the harbour master. So there it was in the south of England, close to the coast, about 2 kilometres from the town of Sheerness on the Isle of Sheppey. And as a result of an absurd error by the harbour master, the Richard Montgomery grounded on Sheerness sands. In other words, it went aground and effectively it sank. So there we see a contemporary photograph of it going down. And note from the photograph that it's also in the process of breaking its back. The Liberty ships were really rather fragile as ships go. More contemporary photographs of what became a wreck. On board, there was a large consist of different kinds of munitions, bombs, fuses, incendiary bombs, phosphorus bombs, small arms ammunition, and so on and so forth. Here we see some pictures of the Richard Montgomery in its present state as a sunken wreck. And there are bombs stacked up in its hold. So all of that happened just off the Isle of Sheppey, which is close to one of the major shipping lanes that leads to the container port of Thames Gateway and to the transshipment points and refinery points on the Isle of Grain in the Thames estuary. After 4 days after the ship went aground, the hull broke open and the ship split gradually into 2 pieces, and that took about 12 days to occur. A salvage company was hired to remove the cargo, and they immediately set to work getting the bombs out of the wreckage of the ship. They managed to get about half of the 6,100 tons of bombs out, but at a certain point, about a month after the ship went aground, they suspended those activities because they were simply too dangerous. It could have resulted in a massive explosion. At this point, it was no longer feasible to remove the cargo, and more than 3,000 tons of bombs remained on the ship. Now, these days we still find Second World War bombs on occasion, often in construction sites when they're unearthed, and special measures have to be taken to safeguard populations whilst the bombs are made safe, the fuses are defused or destroyed, and the bombs are removed. We have also had cases of Second World War bombs that have gone off, causing carnage, and there is still a risk of that. So quite often when we find large bombs like the one in the photograph here, we have to have a mass evacuation that might involve tens of thousands of people evacuated for between 12 and 48 hours, whilst the artificers grapple with the problem of how to defuse and remove the bomb. But what do we do when we've got some 13,700 bombs, which is the number that are estimated to be on board the remains of the Richard Montgomery? Here is a list of what we think is on board. We can't be absolutely sure about it because the end of the salvage operation was somewhat chaotic, and the situation underground is difficult, or underwater, sorry, is difficult to monitor. The water is rather turbid. It is monitored, but it is rather difficult to, at this stage, know exactly what is there. But this is the best estimate of what is on board. And as you can see, we have large numbers of bombs and a wide variety of munitions that are still there, some in waterproof cases. So there we are. The Richard Montgomery lies on the seabed in shallow water on sands, and it contains an estimated 3,173 tons of bombs for a total of about 1,434 tons of TNT equivalent. So let's make a vulnerability scenario for this. We're 2 kilometers off the coast of Sheerness, a town of 11,000 inhabitants. The Isle of Sheppey as a whole has 120,000 inhabitants, and many of them live very close to the wreck, in other words, along the coast of the Isle of Sheppey. There is one major route off the isle, which is a motorway road link to the mainland, which of course is right next to it. It's really not much of a detached island, but nevertheless, it does have an identity as an island. 6 kilometers from the site of the wreck, there is a very large petroleum refinery complex where in 2005 a terminal was built which transships a large portion of the UK's imported liquid natural gas. All I could find were statistics for 1998, but in that year more than 5,000 ships and boats were recorded as passing along the channel which runs very close to the wreck. Over time to that point, since the wreck, there had been 24 near misses, and in a state of fog there had been one collision with the wreck, which fortunately was a very light one and didn't have any consequences. So the wreck is in a rather strategic position, and there was also, under the aegis of the then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, a plan to build the offshore airport for London really right next to the Richard Montgomery on the peninsula that abuts the Isle of Sheppey and the other side of the Medway estuary. So if there were a major explosion, it could clearly have some very serious consequences. Here we see a satellite image of the area, and just off coast there is a slight blip, and that appears to be the Richard Montgomery, part of which is visible above, the masts are visible above water level, and occasionally at low water part of the superstructure too. So there it is, and in this diagram you can see where it was suggested that the new London airport be built. It is of course unlikely to be built, but nevertheless there is plenty of urban industrial development within a very small radius of the Richard Montgomery itself. Here is the site, and here is a vacationer who made his way there, which is strictly illegal and also rather dangerous. Further consideration. The fragmentation bombs appear to be in good condition, but they are armed with fuses, which means that they are in the sort of condition where they could indeed go off if anything happens. The TNT bombs are stored in impermeable cases, but whether they remain impermeable is another matter. And what happens when they cease to be impermeable is imponderable. Every so often, bombs fall out of the hull of the Richard Montgomery through cracks. The hull is deteriorating over time. They fall into the sands. Well, it could be argued, in fact, that the sands around that part of the Thames and Medway estuary are probably full of munitions, because such were conditions in the early 1940s. But nevertheless, it is not a good situation. So every year there is a survey of the Richard Montgomery. Recently, the results have not been made public, but in a survey about 5 years ago, it was suggested that within 2 decades there could be major structural failure as the deteriorating hull collapses, including some of the shelves on which the bombs are laid out. Now, the worst case scenario, of course, would be that everything goes up in one almighty explosion. Let's start by saying it is pretty unlikely, but it is certainly not impossible. Experts in explosions and munitions suggest that this is not a likely scenario at all. However, it could lead to a very difficult, uncontrollable, and above all, unstable situation. But let's look at the worst case. If there were a simultaneous explosion of the entire cargo as it stands, there would be a column of water and debris about 3 kilometers high, which would probably lead to a tsunami about 5 meters high, and probably also a fireball. And the tsunami would direct itself towards nearby residential areas, commercial areas, and of course the industrial complex on the Isle of Grain. And that could lead to some very serious consequences. The town of Sheerness, well, I wrote here that it would cease to exist. I think that is a gross exaggeration on reflection, but it would nevertheless be quite severely damaged. And so would the gas terminal and the oil refineries, which could lead, as it has done in tsunamis, including in recent times, to the rupture of petroleum tanks. And what you then have is a tsunami that travels along the Thames with floating petroleum on top of it in flames. And if that sounds rather improbable to you, remember that in the Japanese tsunami of 2011, exactly that happened, and on a very large scale too, in the town of Kezinuma. So, possible causes of disaster. Supposing a large cargo ship went off course and proceeded into the interdiction area and collided with the Richard Montgomery. Now, navigation aids there are plenty, and communication there is plenty, but we are dealing with the marine equivalent of a motorway here, with a very large amount of shipping traffic on it, and such is not impossible. Perhaps structural failure could give rise to an explosion or a chain of explosions, because of course the alternative to a single massive explosion is that we have several. Spontaneous explosions have been hypothesized as a result of chemical alteration of the bombs and the fuses. That is possible too. What about an act of terrorism? A number of scenarios have been suggested here. There was even a novel written about it, which involved this. And at a time in the 1960s and 70s when students did reprehensible things for charity, it was called Rag Week. Students at Kent University actually took a boat and went out to the Richard Montgomery and commandeered it for a moment. Quite dangerous, that. Marine pollution could also come from leakage from the wreck itself and the bombs on board, because they are, of course, of chemical composition. So, shortly after the war, a process began of annual surveys. Once a year, a company will be chartered to go out there and do a survey of the wreck to see whether its condition had changed. And above all, they were interested in the way that the shifting sands on which the wreck lays would stress the hull. And in fact, the profile of the sands changes every year thanks to marine currents and waves and so on. Well, the early surveys were actually quite simple. They used trays of sand with wooden models and so on, and now of course we use much more sophisticated digital methods. In the meantime, in 2004, New Scientist put forward, this is the magazine, put forward a hypothesis that because the fuses contain the mineral lead azide, when that comes into contact with water vapour, not even water, it can produce an acid, hydroazoic acid, which could in fact corrode the detonation caps, producing copper azide, and that could lead to detonation of the caps and therefore to subsequent explosion. Well, it hasn't happened so far, but one thing that has happened in the recent past is that at night you can sometimes see some very strange light effects on the Richard Montgomery, and this is the result of phosphorus being liberated, and flaming phosphorus will catch fire in water. It will burn in water, and that indeed has happened in the very recent past. So there are measures and there are some options, although quite frankly the options are very limited. In this diagram you see the marine chart. On the bottom side of the diagram you can see the shipping channel, and quite next to it there is a rectangle which is bounded by 4 buoys which sit there and mark the exclusion zone in the middle of which the wreck is, and nobody except the survey ship is allowed into the exclusion zone. So surveillance is maintained by the Coast Guard, the Harbour Master and so on of the exclusion zone to make sure that nobody goes into it, although quite how they could stop someone going into it is another matter, as we saw with the kite surfer or whoever he was who got there last year. Controlled detonation has been suggested, although this I think is probably the worst option of all, and it could lead to something quite catastrophic, so it's highly unlikely. It was suggested that the whole area be drained of water, a sarcophagus of concrete and steel be built around it, and gradually the bombs be brought out and made safe. Well, if that were done, probably the sheer vibrations would cause something awful to happen, so I don't think that that is on the cards either. Building a cofferdam, it would have to be about 1,800 metres long around the wreck, was another suggestion. The trouble with this is it is such a dangerous thing that the population of about half of the Isle of Sheppey would need to be evacuated, and that would probably involve evacuation for a period of 6 months of about 40,000 people, and that would be extremely expensive and also very difficult, and there will be many protests about it. So that then is the situation, and the trouble is that any serious intervention with the ship to remove the bombs risks them all going off, and also the conditions for defusing the bombs, if that were to be done, means that some need to be diffused in dry conditions and some need to be diffused in wet conditions. So if it were possible to build a wall around the wreck and pump it out and make it dry, well, unfortunately that would mean that some of the bombs would be in a much more dangerous state, whereas others would be ready for defusing. So we over time have moved from understanding the situation through wooden models on a bed of real sand to using virtual reality and digital surveys of various kinds and building up 3-dimensional digital models and so on to a level of great accuracy. So as time passes, the surveys become ever more sophisticated and ever more accurate, and this means that our understanding of the risks changes. Unfortunately, what doesn't change in concert with that is our ability to manage the risk. So there we are. Over a long period, the UK government's response was to do very little. Surveillance, a ring of buoys around the wreck marking an exclusion zone. There is apparently a risk analysis, although it is not in the public domain. And one would guess that it suggests that there's really rather a high risk there. And the rest really is inertia and action. I think we can suggest that the government rather hoped that seawater would solve the problem. It would neutralise the bombs and somehow it would cause the problem to go away. But the fact is the problem is still there. In fact, you can go down to the fishing tackle shop in Sheerness. For a certain sum of money, you can hire a boat and do a tour around the Richard Montgomery. In fact, in the 1960s, for 2 shillings and sixpence, you used to be able at 10 a.m. on Saturdays to get a boat trip around it, although that was stopped for obvious reasons at a certain point. But it sits there, and here is a view of it at fairly low tide, where you can see some of the superstructure as well as the masts. It deteriorates over time and it will eventually completely collapse. With what consequences, we simply don't know. So a considerable amount of time has gone by and we have a great deal of inertia, and the worst possible risk would be the largest human-made explosion of a non-nuclear kind in history, about a 1/12 the size of the Hiroshima bomb. Well, okay, it is fairly unlikely. We don't want to scaremonger over this, but nevertheless it's clear that we have a risky situation quite close to an urban and an industrial area, and also a shipping lane, which is something very much to bear in mind, where we could have some very serious problems. Now, in case you think, well, these things never do explode, I'm afraid the reality is they do. In 1917, an explosion occurred on the 6th of December in Halifax, Nova Scotia, when a munition ship collided with a relief ship. They were both bound for Europe, and the munition ship caught fire because it had petroleum barrels of petrol on the deck. Underneath there were bombs and munitions. The crew ran for their lives. 35 of the 36 of them survived as a result. People of Halifax, Nova Scotia were drawn to the site from curiosity looking at the fire, and 20 minutes later the whole lot went up. The ship was blasted into pieces. None of them are larger than a dining table at the very largest. Most of them are considerably smaller. It caused a hole in the sea and a sizable tsunami. It destroyed most of Halifax, Nova Scotia. It killed 2,000 people, injured 9,000 and blinded 236 because of shrapnel. Many others, more than 1,000, had their sight impaired by it as well. And the whole thing was a very significant explosion, and interestingly it also gave rise to the first social studies of disaster. So I think we can say that disaster studies now have a 100-year history as a result of that. In Bari, southern Italy, in 1943, the bombing of the port led to the explosion of a munition ship. About 1,000 military personnel died and 1,000 civilians. In Texas City, Texas, in 1947, a fire aboard a munition ship caused 600 people to die. In July 1967, and this is a little closer to home, there was another case of a sunken munition ship. It was a Polish ship called the SS Kielce, and at the time it was being unloaded and everything exploded. Fortunately, it didn't lead to a tsunami, although one was very much feared at the time. It was off the coast of Dover. But it did cause a magnitude 4.5 earthquake, which is a very large earthquake for an explosion to cause. And it was an indication of the sorts of effect that could take place if such an explosion occurred. So from the moment of the wreckage until 1973, responsibility for the Richard Montgomery was in the hands of the Port of London Authority, who did little other than monitor the site. And in that year, 1973, the Inland Revenue took over responsibility, and it went eventually to the so-called receiver of the wreck, who in effect was the local Coast Guard. It should be noted, though, that the wreck is owned by the United States government, and the United States government have actually offered to make it safe. That offer has been refused, and in point of fact it may be that it is not possible to make it safe, or it certainly isn't safe to try to make it safe, which is probably why it has been refused. The surveys are carried out on behalf of the Ministry of Defence by a private company, and that is the situation at present. So let's conclude something on this basis. Firstly, in a situation like this, we see decades of the fragmentation of responsibility. We also see a failure to face up to what is potentially an enormous risk. Now, obviously, local opinion would like this matter to be solved. In fact, there is a website where local people let off steam, and they write things like, if this wreck were to have sunk outside the Houses of Parliament, it would have been dealt with right away. The fact that it's off a provincial town means that it's still there. So we could say that there is a certain indifference to local opinion, including to the opinion of the local Member of Parliament. And all of this then is grounded in bureaucratic inertia. And you could also argue that the risk is increasing rather than diminishing as the wreck becomes older and more liable to structural failure. So at the moment we are on the horns of a dilemma. To do nothing is risky because the wreck itself will fall apart. But on the other hand, to do something is risky. And it is very hard to say which option involves the least risk. Trying to get some bombs out of the ship and defuse them, or doing absolutely nothing about it. So there we are. The wreck sits there and in its exclusion zone, and nothing has been done. The moral of the story and the general lesson from this then is that as time passes, our understanding of risk changes. It usually improves, it becomes more detailed. So actually does our perception of the risks, and the perception might well be conditioned by the understanding, in other words the data that are obtained. The data show cracks opening in the hull and so on, and possibility of structural collapse of the shelves on which the bombs are laid. On the other hand, the strategies of risk management at present are not reflecting these changes on the Richard Montgomery, and there is the dilemma of what can be done and what is safe to do, or relatively safe to do, and who might do it. So that is the story of the Richard Montgomery, and it prompts one to ask, well, how many more of these cases, similar things, are there around Europe where there are instances of very high risk that are to a greater or lesser extent hidden, or at least are not in the spotlight of public debate? Thank you for your attention.